It is my pleasure to say just a few brief remarks, very brief, about the senior seminar that I taught over the last year, which was called To Sound Like Yourself, a Conversation with Poetry. And this is how it started out. Here's our course description. In this creative writing seminar, students will engage with poetry and poetry writing to explore their lives as well as their personal and cultural histories to gain an understanding of and access points for the conversations that have been happening between artists, primarily poets in this course, but not exclusively, and their texts for centuries. And the fall 2017 aspect of the course was a crash course in both parts of that title, To Sound Like Yourself. The challenge of this entire year has been able to write poetry in such a way where you truly are claiming your power, your voice, your stories in a new and unique way, on your terms, on your form, about what you want to write about. And as we do that, we're also engaging in a conversation with poetry. So in the fall, we went really through a lot of different things, and the way I taught this was thematically. One, we used a book, and I must give acknowledgement to a poet and also an author of a book called Writing Poetry to Save Your Life, Having the Courage to Tell Your Stories. I thank you very much for my brain going blank on me there. But that's Maria Mazziotti-Gillen, who was here not too long ago. She's visited our school many times. And one of the things she says in that book is, it's chapter 1, about claiming your voice, claiming your power. And is that all of us have on our shoulders this crow. It's that part of us, that part of our past, that whispers to us that where we're from isn't interesting, the complaints we have aren't valid, we're not smart enough, we're not interesting enough, who would want to read what we have to say? Basically, that voice in all of us that can kind of render us silent in a number of ways. And she creates this simple metaphor that is easy to conceptualize and harder to practice. And that's the idea that there's this crow on our shoulder. We must constantly chase away the crow that keeps coming back to land while we explore the cave where our deepest, most essential and important stories are. And it's with those two kind of simple metaphors that we move forward, and thematically in the fall had a conversation, both reading and writing with. We started with imagery, and then we went a conversation with poems about family, poems about class, poems about where you're from, which is a loaded idea, poems about gender identity, poems, a conversation with form, a conversation with race, a conversation with love. That was a good week. A conversation with nature, a conversation with yourself, a conversation with grief and mourning, and ending with a conversation with hope. And each week we studied poets and read craft and critical essays related to those thematic ideas, as well as explored a number of writing prompts. Not with really an emphasis early on writing poems, but on seeing what we sound like. A lot of free writing, a lot of associative writing, in-class writing, journaling, to get down to the essence of what indeed we have to say. And then at the end of that first semester, students in submitting a proposal for going forward, it's, well, what is it that you find yourself continually writing about? What kind of subjects, what writers have inspired you the most? And in laying the groundwork for what they were going to do this term, which is write a book-length manuscript of poems, many of those poems being new, many of those being drawn from the raw material of that first semester, so that everyone who is sitting here in front of you from my seminar, and everyone who is not, I don't want to, like they're lazy people somewhere else, but everyone in my seminar wrote a book-length manuscript of poems in a year, which is a remarkable thing. And on the back bulletin board, you'll see that there are 2 pages of poems from each student. There were 12 students, a total of 24 pages. And some of the students who came into this class had taken every poetry class you could take in terms of creative writing, and also many in terms of critical reading of poetry. And then some hadn't had a single poetry writing class or studied very few poems in literature classes. And I would defy you to find who's who back there. Because I think what we ended up having is a group of students who committed to and became real poets. And part of what I was just saying is that you're delving and you're writing and you're claiming your stories and you're writing the stories that matter to you. But you can only feel liberated and open to do that in a community that invites that and respects that and thanks you for that. So before I transition to our presenters, I would just like to thank all of the members of this seminar for committing to each other, committing to your stories, and I thank you for your stories. And I also thank you for the attentiveness and loving and caring that you gave each other as we rigorously, but thoughtfully, and can you kindlessly and rigorously attack something? I think you can. Helped each other try to sound like truly yourself and engage in this conversation with poetry. So the poetry certainly is about reading and presenting your work, but the other half of that is listening and learning from other people's stories, which we certainly did from each other. So being rebels that we are, we've decided to throw the schedule to the wind in the following order. You know, there's no such thing as chaos, really. It's, that's a conversation for another day. But if you look at our presenters, it's Julia and Josh and Beth. If you look at those from the bottom up, you see how that's alphabetical by first name? You know, we could always go alphabetical by last name. We're going to be, if it's not even alphabetical by last name, look at that. But it's alphabetical by first name if you look at it from the bottom up. So we're going to begin with Beth, and then we'll hear from Josh, and then we'll hear from Julia. Each of them will be reading a selection of poems from their manuscript, and they'll be talking to you about those poems and what inspired them. So I would like to begin by inviting up Beth, who's going to read from her book, Gold Steps.